"You are a financial burden, Margaret, and you are no longer welcome in this house." That sentence, delivered by my daughter's husband Chad across a dinner table I'd helped pay for, was the moment I realized they had mistaken my love for weakness, a mistake that would ultimately cost them everything they held dear. I remember every detail of that night, a cold, sharp scene I replay in my mind sometimes, not with anger anymore, but with the measured clarity of someone who has finally achieved true justice, a quiet, devastating justice they never saw coming. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. I was 58 years old, a widow for 6 months, still carrying the hollow ache of losing my husband David after 35 years. I had worked as a medical transcriptionist for most of my adult life, methodical and precise, a quality that would later serve me well in my calculated plan. David and I had lived modestly, saving diligently, and when he passed, the first thing I did was sell our 2-bedroom home in Waco. It was an old place, comfortable but too large for just me, and the money, a clean sum just under $200,000 after paying off the small remaining mortgage, was meant to be my safety net. The plan, which Amanda had pitched with such enthusiasm, was simple. I would move into their house in Cedar Park near Austin, contributing a reasonable amount each month for groceries and utilities, and in return, I would have my daughter nearby and the support of a family during my darkest time. It sounded perfect, a soft place to land. It was anything but. From the moment I crossed the threshold of their large, soulless house, Chad's hostility was a palpable, suffocating force. He was a sales manager for some tech firm, all slick suits and aggressive smiles, except when he looked at me. Then, the smile vanished, replaced by a cold, irritated stare. He'd leave the room when I entered, sigh dramatically if I used the dishwasher, and made pointed comments about the cost of electricity. Amanda, my only child, the girl I had sacrificed so much for, watched all of this and did nothing. Worse than nothing, she constantly minimized it. "Oh, that's just Chad, Mom. He's stressed about work." Or, "Don't take it personally. He's just particular about his space." Her voice, once my source of comfort, became a sound of continuous, low-level betrayal. The tension built over 4 agonizing months. 4 months where I felt less like a mother and more like a barely tolerated guest, slowly being erased from their lives. The culmination came on a Tuesday night. We were sitting at the dining table. I had cooked a slow roast chicken and mashed potatoes, the kind of comfort food I thought might soften the edges of the room. Chad took 3 bites, pushed his plate away, and wiped his mouth with a napkin that seemed crispier than usual. He waited until Amanda was getting up to clear plates, maximizing the awkward silence. He looked directly at me, his eyes perfectly blank, devoid of any human connection. "Margaret, we need to talk about your situation." I knew then. The floor of the dining room, a pale, expensive laminate, seemed to tilt. I set down my fork. "What about it, Chad?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, the transcriptionist in me demanding clarity. "Frankly, you're a financial burden. We thought you moving in would work out differently, that you'd be helping more, but you're just here. We're losing space, our utility bills are through the roof, and frankly the house just doesn't feel like ours anymore. We've decided that you need to find somewhere else to live." The cruelty of his words was breathtaking, not because of the sentiment, but because of the sheer transactional disregard for who I was. I looked at Amanda, who was standing frozen by the sideboard, clutching a handful of plates. Her eyes were lowered, fixed on the pattern of the china. "Amanda?" I asked, my voice now a raw whisper, barely audible above the quiet hum of the refrigerator. "He's right, Mom. It's just not working. It's better this way. We really need our space back." She didn't look up, not once. She just stood there, agreeing with the man who had just told her widowed mother she was worth nothing. I was dismissed, abandoned, and erased in the span of 30 seconds. I remember standing up, the chair scraping loudly against the laminate, a sound that finally made Amanda flinch. I walked away from the table, not arguing, not pleading, just collecting the 2 suitcases I had been too heartbroken to completely unpack in 4 months. By midnight, I was checking into a low-quality motel 15 miles away, the neon sign of a liquor store casting a vulgar red glow into my room. The next morning, I stared at the phone. My daughter had not called. The raw, gut-wrenching grief of losing my husband was instantly replaced by a cold, clean terror. The terror of being absolutely alone in the world, unloved and unwanted by the one person I had counted on. I spent the next 2 months struggling. My age and my outdated skill set were barriers to finding meaningful work in the booming Austin market. I was living off my savings, watching the balance dwindle, feeling the walls close in. The motel was cheap, and the sadness was suffocating. I felt like a ghost, a person who had ceased to matter. Amanda ignored my few, desperate messages, cementing the finality of the betrayal. I was truly at my lowest point, wondering if the best choice wouldn't be to simply stop trying. It was during this period, while going through a small storage box David and I had kept filled with old family papers, that everything changed. In the bottom of the box, beneath my high school yearbooks and a stack of expired passports, I found my mother's diary. She had passed away when I was in my 20s, and I'd never read it, thinking it was just a record of daily life. This was not a record of daily life. The small, leather-bound book contained handwritten entries detailing a secret, passionate affair my mother had had decades ago with a man named Harold James Sterling, an East Texas oilman and the founder of Sterling Energy. My mother had written of their love, the painful choice they made to separate, and a single, stunning truth written on the final page. HJS promised he would always take care of our little Margaret. He set up a trust, silent and secure, managed by his attorney, Leonard Goldstein. Margaret will never want. I sat on the edge of the cheap motel bed, the diary open in my lap, the pages thin and yellowed, my world fractured and reformed in that single instant. I wasn't just the daughter of a hard-working fireman and a quiet homemaker. I was the daughter of a tycoon. The revelation transformed me not just emotionally, but structurally. I wasn't powerless. I had a name, a contact, and a legacy. Leonard Goldstein's office was discreet and luxurious, located in a high-rise in downtown Dallas. Mr. Goldstein, a man whose face was a steady and controlled gravitas, confirmed the entire story. Harold James Sterling had indeed created a substantial, irrevocable trust for me, set up to activate quietly upon the death of my mother, and managed to avoid public notice and potential family disputes from the Sterling side. The assets, he explained calmly, included stocks, bonds, and various real estate holdings totaling just over $1 million. He handed me a folder, heavy with documents. "Margaret," he said, his voice measured, "Mr. Sterling's desire was to ensure your life would be one of security and dignity. This is your birthright. Use it wisely." I flew back to Austin with the folder in the empty seat next to me, no longer a victim seeking shelter, but a strategist armed with resources. The shift inside me was profound. The victim, the grieving widow, the unwanted mother, she was gone. In her place was Margaret Sterling, a woman defined by her inheritance, yes, but more importantly, defined by her new, cold resolve. I would not seek revenge fueled by anger. I would seek justice fueled by calculated, methodical action. The same energy I used to transcribe medical reports, I now funneled into learning. I moved out of the motel and into a temporary, short-term furnished apartment near the Domain, a place clean and quiet where I could work. I studied property law, LLC structures, and the Austin real estate market with the intensity of a surgeon learning a new technique. I opened new bank accounts and established legal communication channels, all under Mr. Goldstein's guidance and the strictest anonymity. My target became clear: restoration of my dignity, and in doing so, holding Amanda and Chad accountable for their greed. My gaze fell upon East Austin, specifically a distressed apartment complex that had just defaulted on its property taxes. The very complex where Amanda and Chad rented their 2-bedroom unit, believing themselves to be in a desirable, up-and-coming neighborhood. It was scheduled for a tax lien auction. The poet in me saw the symmetry. The strategist saw the opportunity. Using my inheritance, with Mr. Goldstein establishing an anonymous holding company called ML Holdings, Margaret Leonard Holdings, though no one would know that. I prepared my bid. We did our due diligence, checking every financial and legal box. The day of the auction, I sat in my lawyer's office, watching the online bidding unfold. It felt clinical, removed, like watching a chess match from a distance. I won the bid. The complex was mine. My first act as the owner of the apartment complex was not one of rage, but of business. I instructed the new property management firm, which had been set up to handle the day-to-day operations and had no direct contact with me, to issue new lease agreements. For every tenant, the rent was increased a modest 10 to 15%, standard for new ownership and planned improvements. For Unit 4B, the two-bedroom occupied by Amanda and Chad, the rent was tripled, effective immediately. I had ensured that the increase was legally defensible, citing comparable market rates for a fully renovated unit in a nearby complex that my future plans would mirror. It was not purely punitive. It was a clear message delivered in the coldest language they understood: money. The rent increase notice was slipped under their door on a Friday afternoon. That evening, my phone, which I had kept silent except for business calls, buzzed with an incoming call from Amanda. I watched it ring, a familiar piercing sound that once would have filled me with longing. Now it was just noise. I did not answer. The silence was my response, a silence that echoed the one she had given me at the dining table months ago, but this time it was a weapon. The property management firm reported the immediate fallout. Chad had stormed into their office, demanding to know the name of the new owner, threatening lawsuits, citing tenant rights, his voice a bellow of entitled outrage. He had gone from accusing me of being a financial burden to suddenly being the victim of one, and the irony was a sweet, satisfying note in the otherwise sterile process. I learned from the reports that he was utterly consumed by the pursuit of the owner's identity, demanding to know who was trying to, quote, squeeze him out. He never once suspected that the old woman he'd discarded was the one signing the property deeds. I maintained an emotional distance, focusing strictly on the professional task at hand. ML Holdings began the process of upgrading the complex. New security cameras, landscaping, fresh paint, and long overdue repairs. Chad's exorbitant rent increase, which he was reluctantly paying because he was locked into a job nearby and refused to admit defeat by moving, was effectively funding the building's revitalization. It was poetic. His greed was now paying for his own discomfort, and ultimately his former mother-in-law's investment. Amanda's messages shifted over the following months. They started as confused and angry texts about the rent, then moved to accusatory remarks about my silence, and finally devolved into brief, weary updates about her life. I didn't respond to any of them. My silence was not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. I needed her to sit in the consequences of her choices, to understand that my love was not a bottomless resource to be abused and discarded. I watched her from a distance, through the property manager's reports, seeing her life with Chad crumble under the financial pressure and his increasing stress. The reports detailed petty disputes with neighbors, late rent payments, and an alarming number of noise complaints stemming from their unit. The unit itself was described as neglected, a mirror of their deteriorating relationship. Then, almost 6 months after the property acquisition, Amanda showed up at my short-term apartment. I opened the door, and for a long moment, we just looked at each other. She was exhausted, pale, and looked years older than her 32 years. Her expensive clothes were rumpled, and the forced smile was completely gone. She looked, for the first time, honest. I stepped aside and let her in. I made no move to hug her, offer comfort, or break the tension. I simply waited. She sat on my pristine white couch, and the dam finally broke. She confessed it all. Chad's controlling behavior had escalated, turning verbally and occasionally physically abusive. He had started stalking her, going through her phone, and blaming her for their financial stress, all of which he attributed to the anonymous new building owner. "He's unraveling, Mom," she whispered, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "And I'm unraveling with him. He just keeps saying, 'It's the old woman, she's coming for us,' but he doesn't know what he means. I wish I hadn't let him push you out. I regret it, Mom. I was weak. I was scared of him. I listened, choosing silence over argument. This was not the time for me to lecture her or seek an apology. This was a fragile step toward a cautious reconnection. I offered her water, not judgment. That visit marked a tentative start. I learned through property management reports that Chad's attempts to uncover the owner's identity had become outright harassment. He sent fake, threatening anonymous notes and frequently confronted the maintenance staff. I simply increased security, added more surveillance, and legally documented every single one of his actions, building a meticulous legal case, not for eviction, but for a restraining order and potential fraud charges related to some falsified income documents he'd used for the original lease. Amanda's situation worsened. Utilities were cut off in their unit due to Chad's neglect of household finances. She was living in near darkness, emotionally drained. The tension culminated with a terrifying noise complaint one evening, involving loud arguments and the sound of breaking glass. The next morning, Amanda returned to my apartment, a small duffel bag at her feet. She looked absolutely defeated, the last vestiges of her privileged entitlement stripped away by fear and exhaustion. "I left him," she said simply, her voice hollow. "I just walked out. I don't know where to go." I let her stay. We shared a quiet moment of fragile reconciliation. She apologized again, this time with true, painful sincerity, not just for the betrayal, but for her own weakness and complicity. I acknowledged my own helplessness during that first crisis, the feeling of being discarded, but I emphasized the strength I had gained through survival. I told her about the diary, about Harold James Sterling, and about the unexpected resources that had saved me. I didn't tell her I owned the building yet. That was for the final act. We began to rebuild our relationship, though forgiveness was still tentative, a distant shore we were swimming toward. The climax arrived a week later. I called a mandatory tenant meeting to announce the final phase of building renovations and property improvements, all funded, as a property manager calmly explained, by the new, necessary rent structure. Chad attended, predictably, a volcano of barely contained rage. He immediately hijacked the meeting, demanding to know the owner's identity, his voice vibrating with accusatory certainty. "This is a clear attempt to force people out. I demand to know who is behind this shell corporation. Who is ML Holdings?" He looked around the small common area, his eyes flashing, daring anyone to speak. I rose slowly from the back of the room, impeccably dressed in a silk blouse and a tailored suit that cost more than his monthly salary. I walked to the front, standing next to the property manager, who was a discreet, professional woman in my employ. I looked directly at Chad, my face a mask of serene neutrality. "I am ML Holdings, Chad," I said, my voice quiet but clear, carrying easily through the stunned silence that followed. "Margaret Sterling is the owner of this building." The blood drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly, sallow white. He opened his mouth to shout, but no sound came out. It was a moment of perfect, absolute power. I let the silence hang, a heavy curtain of undeniable fact. "My legal name is Margaret Sterling, and I purchased this building at a tax auction, a public, recorded sale." I continued, addressing the silent tenants, my tone firm but reasonable. "My priority is to ensure fairness and safe living conditions for all residents, which requires significant investment. You will all be treated fairly, within the terms of your legal leases." Chad finally recovered, his face contorting into a snarl of disbelief. "You? The poor widow? The charity case? You had no money. You lied. You're manipulating us, trying to ruin me." "You are ruining yourself, Chad," I corrected him calmly. "And as for my finances, they are not your concern. Your wife Amanda will attest that you demanded I leave your home, claiming I was a financial burden. I simply complied with your wishes and secured my own future." Amanda, who had been sitting near the back, stood up. She looked at Chad, her eyes blazing with a newfound, terrifying clarity. "Chad, stop. It's over. She's right. You did this, all of this." She walked toward me, not to defend me, but to stand beside me, a physical manifestation of the tectonic shift in our family dynamics. Chad shouted one final, pathetic threat about lawsuits and exposing me, but I simply nodded to the property manager. I believe this meeting is adjourned. You may follow up with our legal counsel. I left the room, Amanda by my side, feeling an empowerment that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with reclaiming my dignity and my narrative. It was not a gleeful exit. It was the quiet satisfaction of justice served. The next day, Amanda handed me my mother's diary, which she had found tucked away in a box while moving her remaining belongings out of the apartment. She had read it. "I'm starting to understand so much, Mom," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "About you, about Grandma, about men who make promises they don't keep and men who do. I'm so sorry I didn't trust you. I'm so sorry I stayed with him." I shared the hardships I endured, the days I felt erased, and the strength I found in my mother's unexpected legacy. Amanda disclosed she had formally filed for divorce and was starting therapy, finally ready to confront the abusive cycle she had entered. We had a healing conversation, tentative and raw, built on acknowledging the past mistakes, both hers and mine, and the cautious hope for a future. Chad's final act was a desperate, threatening email, claiming he had uncovered my identity and the inheritance, promising to use it to expose and ruin me. I immediately forwarded the email to Mr. Goldstein, who responded with a comprehensive cease and desist letter detailing Chad's harassment, the tenant complaints, and the legal violations, complete with an implicit threat of further action based on the falsified documents. Chad fled. He simply packed his car and disappeared, leaving Amanda a rambling, self-pitying note blaming me for his entire downfall. He attempted a few weak social media attacks, but the legal warnings were swift and final. He was gone, erased from our lives by his own toxic nature and the legal consequences of his actions. Amanda moved out of the apartment, found a small place of her own, and continued with therapy, slowly rebuilding her life, no longer defined by Chad's demands. I received confirmation that the building transfer and all legal proceedings related to Chad's harassment were legally complete. Full control was mine. I didn't hold the building. It had served its purpose. I sold the complex quietly to a reputable, community-focused developer. I took half of the profits and made a substantial anonymous donation to a local shelter for women and children in crisis, naming a wing after my mother, Eleanor. I used the remaining funds, which were significant, to buy a small, charming house in my old childhood neighborhood. It was modest, serene, and, most importantly, mine. Amanda helped me move in, our interaction warm but subdued, the foundation of our rebuilt relationship now one of honest respect, not expectation. Chad has never contacted us again, bound by the legal agreements that sealed his silence. That evening, in my new sun-drenched kitchen, Amanda and I shared a simple, joyful dinner. We laughed, a sound I hadn't heard from her in years, a sound that finally felt genuine. Alone later, sitting on my back porch watching the oak tree David had always loved, I whispered a quiet word. I forgive myself. I forgave myself for being weak, for trusting too easily, for thinking I was an extinguished fire. I realized I was never the fire extinguished, but the spark, finally kindled by betrayal, into a controlled, powerful flame. I wrote a final entry in my mother's diary for Amanda to read someday, a message about self-worth independent of others, approval. I am 60 years old now. I am at peace. I am truly home. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.